This is a true story of how the greatest intelligence triumph in history became the blueprint for a world where privacy might no longer exist. In 1940, at a country mansion called Bletchley Park, a small team of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers began breaking Nazi Germany's most secret codes, messages encrypted by a machine called Enigma that the Germans believed was unbreakable. They called their operation Ultra. And what they achieved was extraordinary. They read Hitler's orders before his generals did, hunted U-boats across the Atlantic, deceived the Germans about D-Day, and helped shorten the war by perhaps 2 years, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. Winston Churchill later said, "It was thanks to Ultra that we won the war." But here's what Churchill didn't say, and what the world didn't learn until decades later. The systems, the culture, and the justifications built at Bletchley Park didn't end when the war ended. They evolved, they expanded, and they became the foundation for the modern surveillance state, the NSA, GCHQ, and intelligence agencies around the world that intercept billions of communications every day, monitor entire populations, and operate in secrecy so deep that even elected officials often don't know what they're doing. What you're about to hear is the story of how code-breaking saved freedom and then became a threat to it. How the heroes who defeated Hitler created the tools that might one day be used against us. And the question we have to answer, was it worth it? Summer 1940, Bletchley Park, England. Alan Turing sat at a desk in Hut 8 staring at a sheet of encrypted German text. The paper was covered in 5-letter blocks, meaningless jumbles of letters that looked like gibberish but contained secrets that could decide the war. Outside, the summer sun was setting over the Buckinghamshire countryside, but Turing barely noticed. He'd been at his desk for 14 hours straight, fueled by cold tea and cigarettes, and he wasn't done yet. Turing was 28 years old, a brilliant but deeply awkward mathematician who had been recruited from Cambridge to solve an impossible problem: break the German Enigma cipher. The Enigma machine looked like a typewriter, but it was far more complex. Every time you pressed a key, electrical current passed through a series of 3 rotating wheels, called rotors, and a plug board that scrambled the letters even further. The number of possible settings was astronomical, 1.8 quintillion different combinations. The Germans believed it was mathematically unbreakable, and for years, they'd been right. But Turing didn't think so. He believed that any code created by a machine could be broken by a better machine, and he designed one, the Bombe, an electromechanical device that could test thousands of Enigma settings per minute, searching for the correct combination that would unlock a day's worth of German messages. The first Bombe had been delivered to Bletchley Park in March 1940. It was massive, over 6 feet tall, weighing more than a ton, covered in rotating drums and clicking relays. It made a constant humming noise that filled the room, and it generated so much heat that the operators had to work in shifts to avoid fainting. When it was running, it sounded like a factory. Relays clicking, drums spinning, motors whirring, and the noise was so loud that conversation was nearly impossible. Turing and his team fed the Bombe encrypted German messages, set it running, and waited, sometimes hours, sometimes days, for it to find a match. When it worked, a relay would stop, a bell would ring, and the operators would check the settings. If they were lucky, they'd found the key. If not, they'd adjust and try again. The work was exhausting, frustrating, and often futile. Some days they broke the code within hours. Other days, they worked around the clock and got nothing. And every day at midnight, the Germans changed their Enigma settings, and the entire process started over from scratch. But when it worked, when they found the key and decrypted a message, the results were extraordinary. They could read German military communications in near real time, orders from Hitler to his generals, U-boat positions in the Atlantic, Luftwaffe bombing targets, supply convoy routes, every secret the Germans thought was safe. One morning in June 1940, Turing decrypted a message from German High Command to Luftwaffe units in France. It was an order to prepare for large-scale bombing raids on British airfields, the opening phase of what would become the Battle of Britain. The message gave dates, targets, and the number of aircraft involved. Turing walked the decrypt to the Intelligence Liaison Office, where it was immediately sent to the Air Ministry. Within hours, RAF Fighter Command had repositioned squadrons, reinforced defenses, and prepared for the attack. When the German bombers arrived, they were met by far more resistance than they expected. Losses were heavy, the raid failed, the Germans never knew why. They assumed their operational security had been breached by spies or reconnaissance. They never suspected that their unbreakable cipher had been broken by a machine in a country house in England. That's how Ultra worked. It was invisible, silent, and devastatingly effective. But it was also fragile. If the Germans ever suspected that Enigma was compromised, they would change their procedures immediately, and Bletchley Park would be back to square one, blind, deaf, and unable to help anyone. So a strict protocol was established. Ultra intelligence could only be shared with a handful of senior commanders, and they were forbidden from acting on it in any way that might reveal its source. If a convoy was warned to change course because Ultra had revealed a U-boat ambush, the British would sometimes stage a fake reconnaissance flight first, so the Germans would think they had been spotted by air, not betrayed by their own codes. It was a chess game played in shadows, where every move had to be calculated, not just for its tactical value, but for what it might reveal to the enemy. March 1941. The Battle of the Atlantic. While Turing and his colleagues worked on breaking the German Army and Air Force Enigma, another team, led by a cryptanalyst named Harry Hinsley, was focused on the naval version used by U-boats. The naval Enigma was even more complex. It had an extra rotor, different key procedures, and stricter security protocols. For months, it resisted every attempt to break it, but in May 1941, everything changed. The British destroyer HMS Bulldog forced U-110 to the surface and captured it before the crew could scuttle it. A boarding party, led by Sub-Lieutenant David Balmy, climbed aboard while it was still wallowing in the water, at risk of sinking at any moment. Inside, they found an intact Enigma machine, and more importantly, code books listing the daily settings used by German U-boats. The materials were rushed to Bletchley Park. Within weeks, Hinsley's team was reading German naval messages. For the first time, the Allies could see what the U-boats were doing, where they were positioned, what their orders were, and where they planned to strike. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Convoys could be rerouted around known U-boat positions. Escort ships could be directed to areas where submarines were operating. And instead of sailing blind into ambushes, Allied commanders could see the battlefield. Not perfectly, but enough to turn the tide. In 1941, before naval Enigma was broken, U-boats sank over 3 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1943, after ultra-intelligence was fully operational, that number dropped dramatically. By May 1943, Black May, U-boat losses were so catastrophic that Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered his submarines to withdraw from the North Atlantic. Harry Hinsley, reflecting on this years later, said, "We didn't win the Battle of the Atlantic with ships or depth charges. We won it with mathematics and patience, and most of the sailors who survived never knew why. But there was a cost. A moral cost that the code breakers carried for the rest of their lives. The convoys they let die. Not every convoy could be saved. Sometimes saving a convoy would have revealed the ultra secret. And when that happened, the decision was made at the highest levels of government to let the ships sail into ambushes. In March 1943, convoy HX-229 steamed eastward across the North Atlantic, carrying food, fuel, and ammunition desperately needed by Britain. At Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts decrypted German messages revealing that a wolf pack of at least 11 U-boats was positioned directly in the convoy's path. Senior officials gathered in a secure room at the Admiralty in London. The intelligence was clear. If they rerouted the convoy, they could save it. But if they rerouted suddenly without explanation, the Germans would get suspicious. They would start asking questions. How did the Allies know where the U-boats were? Was the code broken? The decision was made. HX-229 would continue on its current heading. No rerouting, no warning. Over 3 nights in mid-March, the Wolfpack attacked. 21 ships were sunk. Over 350 men died in the freezing water, men whose deaths might have been prevented by a single decoded message. At Bletchley Park, a young cryptanalyst named Peter Ashford read the casualty report in silence. He'd known it was coming. He'd read the Enigma messages. He'd watched the wolf pack assemble. And he'd sat in his chair breaking codes while men died because of a decision someone else had made. One of his colleagues, a woman named Joan Clark, came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault, Peter." "Isn't it?" he said quietly. "We knew. We could have warned them. And if we had, we'd lose Ultra, and thousands more would die. That's what they tell us. Because it's true." Peter didn't answer. He just stared at the casualty report and thought about the men who had drowned in the freezing Atlantic because someone far away, safe and dry, had decided their lives were worth less than a secret. This was the moral calculus of Ultra. Save the few and risk losing the many, or sacrifice the few to protect the advantage that might save thousands. It was a choice no one should have to make, but someone did. And they made it again and again throughout the war. May 8, 1945, VE Day, Bletchley Park, victory in Europe Day. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Across Britain, people poured into the streets, dancing, singing, celebrating. In London, Churchill addressed the crowds from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Soldiers embraced their families. Pubs ran out of beer. The nightmare was finally over. At Bletchley Park, the mood was quieter. The codebreakers gathered in the courtyard, listening to Churchill's speech on the radio. Some were crying, tears of relief, exhaustion, grief for the colleagues they'd lost and the knowledge they'd carried. Others were just numb. They'd worked around the clock for 6 years, breaking codes, reading secrets, knowing things no one else could know. And now it was done. Or so they thought. Within weeks, orders came down from the top. The bomb machines were to be dismantled and destroyed. The work of Bletchley Park was to remain classified indefinitely. No one was to speak about what they had done, not to family, not to friends, not to anyone. The Official Secrets Act carried severe penalties, up to 14 years in prison for violations. For many of the codebreakers, this was devastating. They'd won the war, but they couldn't tell anyone. They couldn't take credit. They couldn't even talk to the colleagues they'd worked alongside for years. The mission was classified, the triumphs were secret, and the trauma, the guilt of knowing about convoys they couldn't save, the exhaustion of 6 years under impossible pressure had to be buried. Joan Clark, one of the few female cryptanalysts allowed to work at Bletchley Park, later said, "We thought when the war ended we'd be free, but we weren't. The secrecy just got deeper, and for some of us, that silence was harder to carry than the work itself." Alan Turing stayed on for a while, working on new projects, early computers, artificial intelligence, mathematical biology. But he was broken by the war and by what came after. In 1952, he was arrested for homosexuality, convicted under British law, and given a choice: prison or chemical castration. He chose castration. Stripped of his security clearance, he was barred from continuing the work he devoted his life to. In 1954, he died from cyanide poisoning. The official verdict was suicide, though some believe it was an accident. The nation he had saved turned on him because of who he loved. Turing's death was a tragedy, but it was also a warning, a sign of how the systems built to defend freedom could just as easily be turned against the people who created them. 1946, the permanent surveillance state is born. While the codebreakers were being silenced, the systems they had built were being repurposed. In late 1945, as the celebrations faded and the reality of post-war Europe set in, British and American intelligence agencies faced a question: what do we do with the enormous code-breaking infrastructure we built to defeat Germany? The government code and cipher school, the formal name for Bletchley Park, didn't shut down. It was reorganized and renamed the Government Communications Headquarters, or GCHQ. The mission was simple: continue intercepting and decrypting foreign communications, especially Soviet communications. In the United States, the transition was messier. Wartime code breaking had been split between the Army's Signal Intelligence Service and the Navy's OP-20G. After the war, there was bureaucratic chaos as different agencies fought for control. In 1949, the Armed Forces Security Agency, AFSA, was created to unify signals intelligence. In 1952, it became the National Security Agency, the NSA. The techniques, technologies, and organizational structures developed during World War II became the foundation for these new agencies. The bombs were gone, but their successors, early electronic computers like the Colossus, were being built specifically for code breaking. The methods used to break Enigma, statistical analysis, pattern recognition, brute force testing, were adapted for Soviet cipher systems, and the culture of secrecy that had defined Ultra was amplified. GCHQ and the NSA were even more classified than their wartime predecessors. Their budgets were hidden, their facilities were unmarked, their employees were forbidden from discussing their work, even with family. The agencies operated in a legal gray zone, with minimal oversight and almost no public accountability. But there was something new too, something that hadn't existed during the war. The emergency that had justified mass surveillance, the existential threat that had made it acceptable to read everyone's messages and sacrifice lives to protect secrets. That emergency was over. Germany had been defeated. Japan had surrendered. The war was won. But the surveillance didn't stop. It just found a new enemy, the Soviet Union, the Venona Project, reading the spies. During and after World War II, Soviet intelligence agencies, especially the NKVD and GRU, sent thousands of encrypted cables between Moscow and their stations in New York, Washington, and London. These cables contained instructions for spies, reports from agents, and details about intelligence operations targeting the Manhattan Project, the State Department, and other sensitive areas. The cables were encrypted using a one-time pad system, theoretically unbreakable if used correctly, but the Soviets made a critical mistake. Under wartime pressure to produce encryption keys quickly, they reused portions of the pads. And American cryptanalysts, working in a nondescript office in Arlington, Virginia, began exploiting that vulnerability in 1943. The project was codenamed Venona. It was slow, painstaking work, far harder than breaking Enigma. A single message might take months or years to decrypt, and even then, only fragments might be readable. Code names had to be cross-referenced with other intelligence. Patterns had to be analyzed. Context had to be inferred. But by 1946, they were making progress. And what they found was devastating. Venona revealed that Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, had passed detailed atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets, including designs for the plutonium implosion device used in the Nagasaki bomb. His intelligence accelerated the Soviet nuclear program by at least 2 years. It revealed that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had been part of a spy ring that stole military and scientific secrets. Both were eventually executed in 1953, a controversial decision that still divides historians. It revealed that Kim Philby, a senior British intelligence officer and liaison to American agencies, was a Soviet mole who had betrayed countless operations and agents. Philby defected to Moscow in 1963 and lived there until his death in 1988, and it revealed the scale of Soviet infiltration. It wasn't a few isolated agents, it was a systematic, large-scale effort involving hundreds of people, many of whom were never publicly identified. Venona was built using the same techniques, the same organizational structures, and many of the same people who had worked on Ultra. The codebreakers who had defeated Hitler were now fighting Stalin, and the systems they had created to win one war were being used to fight another, a war that never ended, a war that would eventually be called the Cold War. One American official, reading early Venona decrypts in 1948, wrote in a memo, "We are facing an enemy that is more patient, more disciplined, and more deeply embedded than we imagined. This is not just espionage. This is preparation for a long war." And so the surveillance continued, the interception continued, the secrecy continued. What had been justified as a temporary measure to defeat fascism became permanent policy to contain communism. And then, after the Cold War ended, it became permanent policy to fight terrorism. And then, after that, it just became policy, permanent, unquestioned, normalized. The world we live in now, today, the descendants of Ultra are everywhere. The NSA intercepts billions of communications every day: emails, phone calls, text messages, social media posts, internet traffic. GCHQ monitors fiber optic cables carrying global communications. Other countries, Russia, China, Israel, France, and dozens more, run similar operations. The invisible web of interception and encryption that the code breakers built during World War II has grown to cover the entire planet. The scale is staggering. According to documents leaked by Edward Snowden in 2013, the NSA collects metadata on virtually every phone call made in the United States. It has direct access to the servers of major technology companies through a program called PRISM. It intercepts internet traffic at key junction points around the world, and it stores vast amounts of this data in massive facilities like the Utah Data Center, which has a storage capacity measured in yottabytes, millions of trillions of gigabytes. The justifications are always the same: security, safety, the threat of the next attack, terrorism, espionage, cybercrime. The list of threats is constantly updated to justify keeping the surveillance running. But the infrastructure they've built, the data centers, the algorithms, the legal frameworks, is permanent. It doesn't shut down when the threat passes, because the threat is always redefined to justify keeping it running. And here's what's important. The legal and ethical frameworks that allowed this to happen were created during World War II at Bletchley Park under the justification of defeating an existential threat. The idea that governments should be able to read anyone's messages, anytime, anywhere, for reasons of national security. That started with Ultra. One historian put it this way: Ultra didn't just help win World War II, it created the template for how modern states exercise power. The emergency powers granted during the war were never fully rolled back. The surveillance justified to defeat fascism became surveillance to contain communism, and then surveillance to fight terrorism, and now it's just surveillance. Permanent, normalized, and largely invisible to the people it targets. Now I want you to think about something. Was it worth it? Ultra saved lives. It shortened the war by perhaps 2 years. It stopped Hitler. No one disputes that. But in doing so, it also created a system, a culture, a legal framework, a technological infrastructure that has been used ever since to justify mass surveillance, government secrecy, and the erosion of privacy. Would Alan Turing approve of what his work became? Would the code breakers at Bletchley Park, who worked in secret to defend freedom, be proud or horrified to learn that their techniques are now used by governments to monitor their own citizens? And here's the hardest question of all. Can we separate the triumph from the legacy? Can we celebrate what Ultra achieved without endorsing what it became, or are they inseparable? Did saving freedom in 1945 require building the surveillance state we live in today? I want you to leave a comment and tell me what you think. Do you believe that modern surveillance, mass data collection, internet monitoring, encrypted message interception is justified because it protects us from threats? Or do you think it's a betrayal of the freedoms that Ultra was supposed to defend? If Alan Turing were alive today, do you think he'd see the NSA and GCHQ as a continuation of his work, or as a perversion of it? And here's the question I really want you to wrestle with. Has code breaking protected us, or has it turned the state into the very thing it once fought against? Because that's the uncomfortable truth about Ultra. It won the war, but it also opened a Pandora's box that can never be shut. The tools that defeated fascism are the same tools that governments now use to watch, monitor, and control their own populations. And once you build that infrastructure, once you normalize the idea that the state should be able to read everyone's secrets, you can't unring that bell. Was the price worth it? Let us know in the comments. Because this isn't just history. This is about the world we live in right now, and the world we're building for the future. If this story challenged you, if it made you question what you thought you knew about security, freedom, and the trade-offs we've made, share this video, subscribe. Because the stories that make us uncomfortable, the ones that force us to ask hard questions, are the ones we need most. Ultra won the war. But it also built the cage we might be living in, and whether that's a triumph or a tragedy depends on which side of the surveillance you're on.